Hello, you will know that I'm not Lord Plant, and I'm sorry to say he's still unwell, and so I'm the fill-in professor now. And I gave one lecture already, of four that I'm going to give, and they're based on my little book that I published last year called The Evidence for God, where part of my argument there is that evidence isn't the sort of thing that scientists look for, publicly available stuff that you can't deny and that you can form theories about and measure. Rather, the evidence is of a rather different sort. And in my first talk, I talked about art and morality and a particular way of seeing art and morality as conveying or communicating or mediating some transcendent depth or reality, which could be called a spiritual dimension to art and music. Not everybody sees them that way. I do, and lots of people do. And it's a way of approaching ideas of God, which is quite helpful if you don't like God very much. And in our culture, lots of people don't like God because they think God is a sort of interfering busybody. I remember somebody who said God was like a pig snuffling at the edges of the universe. I won't tell you who that was, but it was on television. It was a rather remarkable thing to say. He was Jewish as well, so it was a very remarkable thing to say. So if you have a nasty idea of God like that, then approaching God, the idea of God, through experiences of beauty in art and experiences of moral obligation and demand and attraction in morality, that gives you more of an idea, I think, of God as the source of objective values that we experience. And I argued that as a philosopher, I think all knowledge begins with experience, good old empiricist position, but you have to interpret experience, and I held it's wrong to interpret experience as just experience of physical objects and nothing more. So there was nothing in reality but physical properties. And that interpreting experience as communicating objective, existing values is a very sensible way to talk about experience, because experience is nothing like the real world. Why not? Well, I'm going to go into that today. Today, my talk is called The Idealist View of Reality. And I'm going to say what idealism is. I am an idealist as a philosopher. I actually remember the very first philosophy book I read when I was quite young was called The Idealist View of Life by Radhakrishnan, who was the Spalding Professor of Eastern Religion and Ethics at Oxford and later became the President of India. And I think that book's obviously been influential because here I am, a priest of the Church of England and an idealist. Horror. Well, what is an idealist? I think the easiest way to go into that is to contrast idealism with its philosophical opposite. And its philosophical opposite is materialism. That's another word that is often misinterpreted. A materialist in philosophy is not somebody who accumulates lots of cars and jewels and is interested in material things. A materialist is somebody, philosophically, who says there is nothing but material things. That's all there is. There are various sorts of materialists. Very hardline materialists, what you would call reductive materialists, think that there really is nothing but whatever matter is. I mean, that's a problem. What is matter? I think if you ask a physicist, they'll probably say, look, we don't talk about that. But we do know that matter is a form of energy, but there are all sorts of matter, including dark matter, and all sorts of things we haven't ever thought about. So it's hard to put limits on what matter is. But supposing you think it's electrons and photons, I mean, it's not. It's something smaller than that, or something fuzzier than that. But anyway, whatever it is, a hardline reductive materialist will say everything, what you think, what you feel, your consciousness, everything in the world, reduces ultimately to lumps of matter in various complicated arrangements. Now, there are respectable philosophers who take that view. The most famous ones are the Churchlands in America and Daniel Dennett, I think, who's very well known. And they really take that view, which I just find incredible to begin with. But I read The New Scientist every week for my sins, I think, perhaps. It's an interesting volume. But it's full of reductive materialists. It's quite quite extraordinary. And I read a book review in the latest issue of the New Scientist which said, oh, this book that I'm reviewing, it has such a view of science that it even might let in the supernatural. That was obviously a criticism, which I would have thought was actually a good thing, but there you are. So that's a reductive materialist, but you can be a non-reductive materialist, and that would be a person who says, well, there are thoughts and feelings and consciousness. They do exist, and there are values, like values in art and in music, things which are of value and which really do exist. But then they are emergent phenomena. They spring out of material things and couldn't exist without them. So this sort of emergent materialist, they're often called these days expansive or enriched naturalists. That's the way they like to describe themselves. And they, they will say, well, yes, values exist, but if there weren't brains and people who valued things, there wouldn't be any values. So that values are solely epiphenomenal. They depend upon material things, couldn't exist without them. And probably the only causal factors in the universe are material factors. That is, things like photons interacting with other subatomic particles. Those are the causal things in the universe. Minds, for example, don't cause anything. Now, let's just look at those two assertions for a moment, because really, is there much reason to believe them? Well, there's some reason to believe them, but I don't think very much. So take the first one. Nothing actually could exist. There couldn't be anything without matter, without material particles. The most obvious way of saying this is there couldn't be minds without brains. I mean, my old colleague Richard Dawkins, my very old colleague Richard Dawkins, actually takes it for granted that there can't be an intelligent creator of the universe because you can't have intelligence without mind, and you can't have minds without brains. So obviously there couldn't be a creator who didn't have a brain. Well, there you are, that's what he thinks. He takes that for granted. Now, I just want to put the question, why not? What's wrong with the possibility? I'm not proving anything here. I'm just saying, how can somebody say there's nothing but matter, and if there are things called consciousness and minds, they have to depend upon matter. Where does the have to come from? Where do they get that from? How do they prove that? It's just a dogma, really. It's an absolute dogma. It's a faith of the worst sort. That is to say, there's not much evidence for it. I mean, you can say that I've seen lots of material things. Well, okay, good. Yeah. Have you never seen an immaterial thing? Well, let's take a simple example, a law of nature. Are there any laws of nature? What about the inverse square law, the law of gravity? What about that? Is that a material thing? No, it's not a material thing. But, you see, you might say, laws only exist if there is matter, and laws just tell you how matter behaves. So laws of nature describe how matter behaves. But in modern physics, that is no longer true. In modern physics, my colleagues in Oxford anyway, tell me that this universe, the whole universe of space and time, and all the matter in it, all the matter is in space and time, obviously. I mean, that's where it is. And space and time originates from something beyond space and time. And it originates from what is called the quantum vacuum. That is where energy is at its lowest possible state. Right? It's not nothing, it's a whole host of different sorts of energy in more or less equilibrium, but there are fluctuations in this equilibrium, and they produce little subatomic particles which spring in and out of existence. Anyway, there you are. The whole universe and matter and everything in it originates from something else beyond matter, the quantum vacuum. And how does the quantum vacuum manage to fluctuate? It fluctuates in accordance with quantum laws, with the laws of quantum physics. Now, it follows that these people, who are absolutely brilliant mathematicians and physicists, they really think, and they're not doing theology, they're doing mathematical physics, they really think that matter originates in accordance with laws of nature, quantum laws, which must have existed before there was any matter, because the matter comes into existence in accordance with the quantum laws. So it cannot be true that they think the laws just describe how matter acts. On the contrary, the laws tell matter how it's going to act, and the laws actually create matter. You know, some of my colleagues like to talk very misleadingly about these days we believe in the bootstrap theory of the universe. And the bootstrap theory is the universe pulls itself into being by its own bootstraps. In other words, out of nothing. You get creation out of nothing. But it's not nothing. You've got the quantum vacuum, which is extremely rich, a lot of stuff there. We don't even imagine what sort of stuff it is. It's not matter anyway, it can't be. And the laws of quantum physics, and they're not matter either, and they exist in order to produce the universe. So modern physics has got itself into a state where it cannot be materialistic. That's the irony of materialism, that materialists think they're being scientific, but quantum physicists say, well, actually, matter is a very mysterious sort of stuff, and it originates from something beyond the material. Let me take another example. That example is just to say there are laws of nature, they're real. According to quantum physics, they bring the universe into existence even, so they exist. Where do they exist? That's the question. They're not just descriptions of how matter behaves, because they bring matter into existence and make it behave in certain ways. So where could they be? What sort of reality could laws of nature be? And that's why I think hardline materialism is a non-starter. I really do think that. I don't see how physics could cope with materialism at all when it says, well, A, we don't know what matter is. There's dark matter, dark energy. It's a form of energy, but you know, we can't put limits on the sorts of energy there are, and that's the clue. You cannot put limits in advance on the sorts of things that exist. You just have to find out, right? You can't say, oh, that can't be non-material things. You have to look and see. Do you think there are well, I think there are lots of non-material things. I mean, the most obvious one is your consciousness. But then you may say, oh, you're just begging the question because consciousness couldn't exist without a brain. So my question now is, why not? Because quantum physicists say laws can exist without a universe. Right? So why couldn't you have consciousness without a brain? I mean, I'm not interested in whether consciousness does exist without a brain or not. Right? That's not my point. It's just that it could. You could have a view, not watching television, you could just see Everest now. You could just see. You'd feel a bit odd if you did, but you're just sitting there and suddenly you see Mount Everest. But you wouldn't be there. Now, all I'm asking you is that conceivable? Could it possibly happen? Well, we have dreams. We have daydreams. Some people do see things, you know, that other people can't see, or they say they do. So why is it impossible? So that's my simple question, really. How could you be a materialist who says there's nothing but matter? How could you know that? How would you find out that there was something immaterial, something not made of matter? Well, not by looking, because when you look, you see matter. So if you want to see something non-material, you can't observe it. You'd have to come by means of a theory of some sort, that you'd have to say, well, the reason matter behaves in the way that it does is because of laws of nature, and they are not material. And they're not just descriptions because they say, they make it true that matter will be of a certain sort, that there will be superstrings or quarks or whatever there are. They are brought into existence in accordance with these laws. The other little example from physics I want to take, and I think I mentioned it briefly last time, is the multiverse theory. A lot of physicists accept the multiverse theory, and that theory is that there are many, perhaps an infinite number, of different universes, of different space-times. And if there are, then if you ask the question, you say, well, there are a huge number of other space-times, where are they? The answer has to be nowhere. It has to be, because they're not in space, because space is as Einstein correctly, in my view, put it, space is a relationship between objects such that in one universe, every object is spatially related to every other object. You can get there by walking if you've got an infinite length of time. Right? So that's a universe. It's where every space is connected to every other space. But another universe is another place where you have everything connected to everything spatially in that universe, but nothing in that universe is connected spatially to anything in this universe. You cannot walk from one universe to another. You cannot physically get from one universe to another. It follows that if there are two different universes, neither of them are anywhere. Right? They can't possibly be anywhere. They absolutely cannot be in space, because space is a relationship between events in one universe. So there are many spaces on the multiverse theory, and even worse than that, there are many times. Now, this is really a mind bender. You think, I can just get my head around saying there are different spaces, so there are things which could exist. We could never find out, actually, really. But you could say there are things which do exist which are not spatially connected to anything in this universe, so they're not anywhere. They're certainly not in space. They're not anywhere at all. And you say, I can just imagine that. But now I'm going to tell you, as a quantum physicist would, there are things which are not in time as well. Every universe that exists is not in time. So if it asks the question, when does it exist? Does it exist now? The answer is no. Did it exist yesterday? No. Will it exist tomorrow? No. Oh, so it doesn't exist? Yes. It exists, but it doesn't exist at any time. Well, surely it must exist at the same time as something. No, it doesn't. Because time is a relationship between events in a universe. Right? If there's another universe, there may be time in that universe, there probably is, but it won't be related to this universe temporally at all. So how can you distinguish between two different universes if neither of them are in space or time? And you can't say they exist now, and you can't say they exist over there. Well, the only way you can do it, and the philosopher Leibniz said this quite a long time ago, the only way you can do it is by defining a universe in terms of the internal relationship between events in that universe. So a universe is a connected set of events, connected in a special contingent way. Now, when I say contingent, I mean it doesn't have to be that way. Two things are related to one another, but they don't have to be related like that. So space is a relationship between things like that. We know what space is. And time is a different sort of relationship, one thing after another. But not everything needs to be spatially or temporally connected to everything else. And any physicist who believes in the multiverse theory thinks there are millions of things which are not spatially or temporally connected to anything else. So they're saying there are millions of things which don't exist anywhere, and they certainly don't exist now. Now, how paradoxical do you want to get? You can't get much more paradoxical, but it's obviously true. You just have to live with it, right? There it is. So how can somebody say, I know that everything must be material, that there can't be anything which is not in space? I mean, physics just says you're wrong, I'm sorry. That's just a defect of your imagination. You're just not imaginative enough. And that's what's wrong with materialism, lack of imagination. Right? You just can't think of what sorts of things there could be. Do you remember the Tom Stoppard play, which intentionally misquoted Shakespeare? There are more things in my philosophy, Horatio, than there are in heaven and earth. Right? Well, that's right, there probably are. Right? And an idealist certainly has more things in philosophy than there are in heaven and earth, because we idealists have things which are not in space or time and don't exist anywhere, and certainly don't exist now. And we have lots of them. So there you are, live with it. Right. Can we say any more than that? So the first thing is, it's a possibility. It's an unduly parsimonious ontology to say everything has to be material. There's no has to be about it. You could, of course, be a little less hard-headed and say, well, not everything has to be material. It just happens that everything is material. Okay, so that's a sort of a lesser claim. It's not a necessity. It's a matter of fact that there are no non-material things. Well, do we know everything about what exists? 50 years ago we didn't know about dark matter, and now it's supposed to be the majority of stuff that exists in this universe. And we know virtually nothing about it. And any decent scientist would say, it's true, we know virtually nothing. You know the story about Newton. He said, I feel like a child on the seashore throwing a pebble into the sea. Newton didn't even believe in gravity. Now, that's an astounding fact. Newton actually said, he invented gravity, in case you can't remember. He did invent gravity. But in Principia Mathematica, his great work, which propounded the laws of gravity, the laws of mechanics, he said, anybody who thinks that there can be action at a distance must be insane. What is gravity if it's not action at a distance? Newton said, I don't know. What he privately thought, but he didn't put in the Principia, he did put in another book that he wrote, what he privately thought is that God arranges it all so that things like the moon and the earth can have action at a distance, but because God is coordinating their activities. But he didn't really think it was possible to have action at a distance. He just recorded that it happened. He didn't pretend to understand it. Now, that's real science. You don't have to understand everything. You have to be able to come up against a simple, neat, elegant mathematical description of as many things as possible. And that's what you do. But you don't understand it. So, again, what I'm appealing to here is the fact that a materialist view is a limitation which is not merited by modern science. And before 1925, if anybody had talked about quantum physics, they wouldn't have been believed. In fact, in 1925, when quantum mechanics was first formulated, it wasn't believed. Einstein never believed it. The one thing that Einstein never believed was things in quantum physics like Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy. You probably know one of the most famous quotations from Einstein, God does not play dice with the universe. He was a determinist, not on scientific grounds, but just on dogmatic grounds. I mean, he just thought everything has to be determined because that's the best sort of universe there could be, because everything is causally connected to everything else in predictable ways, and the universe has to be like that. Now, nobody's going to mock Einstein for believing that, but he was wrong. He spent the last years of his life trying to prove his view that indeterminacy was not correct. Now, he might have been right. In the next year, somebody may say, oh, I've just discovered something, he was right. So I'm not saying he was wrong. Yes, I am. What I'm saying is he is believed by most quantum physicists to have been wrong, because indeterminacy just is a fact about quantum physics. And that means it's not no quantum physics. Most quantum physicists think that indeterminacy, that is lack of determination, is a fundamental feature of our universe. That you can never, in principle, predict exactly when a radioactive atom will decay. You can give a probabilistic estimate of a time, a half-life, at which it will decay, but you can't, in principle, you just can't ever predict it. And it's not that you can't predict it, it actually doesn't have, I mean, the principle of indeterminacy, what it says is, so-called fundamental particles, like electrons or photons, they do not possess, at the same time, both position and momentum, velocity. Okay. So if you're talking about an electron, you're talking about something which does not possess both a position somewhere and a velocity. It's going at a certain speed. Now you say, how could that possibly be? All I say is, well, that's what most physicists think there are. And of course, what they say is that electrons aren't particles at all, actually. So live with that, too. You say, well, if you're somebody who thinks electrons are little particles which go around the nucleus of an atom, sorry, you're obsolete. You're out of date. They're not. So what are they? Well, I don't know what they are. Nobody knows what they are. They're actually, when they're not being observed, wave functions. And a wave function is something which, if you square the amplitude of a wave, you find the probability of finding electron if you make an observation at that point. It's only a probability. It might not be there. It might have gone to Starbucks. It might be anywhere. And that's true. That's what they say. So that a wave function is what an electron actually is when it's not being observed. Now, this is where idealism looms its horrible head. There's a difference between reality when it's being observed and reality when it's not being observed. Now, again, this is totally mind-bending, but this is quantum physics. If any of you have seen Jim Al-Khalili, an excellent little series on television about quantum mechanics, have you seen that? I mean, it's very good, very good. He's obviously a very good quantum physicist, and the series is very good, and that's what he says. Things, when they're observed, are completely different from things when they're not being observed. So electrons, and there are experiments to prove this, but I'm not going to go into this. Read Jim Khalili if you want to see about the experiments. But it is a proof, there's a proof, experimental proof of this, that electrons have a location, a position, and they're particles at that position when they are observed by a human mind. But when they are not being observed, they are wave functions. They aren't particles. That's why they don't have particular position and momentum, because they're not particles at all. They are wave functions. And I've told you what a wave function is. Even if nobody can understand it, it's something which the square of its amplitude gives you the probability of finding an electron. Right. So are they real? Well, again, I tell you, I read the New Scientist, and in this week's issue, it says, yes, somebody's just done an experiment which shows there really are wave functions. Well, but maybe they have. But this is one of the great disputed points in quantum physics. There are hundreds of disputed points. I mean, it's not a settled subject. It's in its infancy, but it still is what physics actually is. State-of-the-art physics tells you that we don't know what's real. So are particles real, but we just can't get the information on them to say where they are and what speed they're going at the same time, but particles are real nonetheless. That's what Einstein thought. He said there really are particles, we just can't get the information. Or are wave functions real? So wave functions are mathematical constructs, really, of fuzzy things where you say it's called superposition, that electrons actually are in lots of places at the same time until you see them. Right? Is that real? And I have to tell you, the state of play at the moment is there's huge disagreement about which is real. Are particles real, but we just can't get the information? Or are wave functions real? And particles are how wave functions appear to us. Now, this brings observation into philosophy with a vengeance. And I want to refer briefly to a book by Stephen Hawking called The Grand Design. It's his latest book. It's a couple of years old now. And in The Grand Design, Stephen Hawking actually says this. I'm just saying what Stephen Hawking says. I'm not making this up myself. He says because of the two-slit experiment and what's called the delayed choice experiment, again, I'm not really going to go into that. Because of these experiments, we have to say that objects only exist as we see them when we see them. They don't exist in that way when we don't see them. Right? Now, in a way, this is quite familiar. You know, the example I always take is here we are, a number of solid objects sitting in a room, wearing clothes of different colors, and in 3 dimensions, obviously. Now, any physicist will tell you that is not what is in this room when there's nobody in it. Oh, perhaps if everybody in it is asleep. All right, so if you all go to sleep, which won't be long now, you all go to sleep, solid objects wearing colored clothes in 3 dimensions do not even exist. Right? Now, the person who first said this philosophically, well, perhaps not first, but most famously, was Bishop George Berkeley, who is buried in my college in Oxford. I have said good morning to him when I go in the mornings. He never replies, unfortunately, but he might be there, but he hasn't got a body, so I can't see him. Anyway, there's George Berkeley. And George Berkeley's challenge to empiricist philosophers like me, all knowledge begins with experience, right? So that's where we start. And then George Berkeley's challenge is, well, all right, all your knowledge begins with experience, and your experience is of solid, colored, three-dimensional objects. That's what your experiences are. Now, when you imagine going out of this room, right, or everybody falling asleep in this room, do things still look the way they look when you're looking at them? And Berkeley pointed out that actually there's no way of telling, for a start, right? Because the only way you could find out if things look the way they look when you look at them is by looking at them. But if you want to find out what they look like when you're not looking at them, there is no way of discovering. You can't do it. But it's actually worse than that. It's not just you can't tell. We can show that they don't have the properties they have when we look at them. In other words, the mind creates those properties. Out of what? Well, wave functions. Right? So you take colors, for example. That's the most obvious thing. Any color is just an electromagnetic vibration at a specific wavelength. That's what it is. So it's not a color until that wavelength hits the rods and cones in your eyes. That passes electrical stimuli to your brain, and in about 30 different parts of your brain, it's enormously complicated, the idea of a color appears in your consciousness. But the color is just in your consciousness. It's not in reality. So if you're not conscious, that color is not there. There is something there. It's an electromagnetic wavelength. That's what's there. And we know there are lots of those that we can't see. Anything ultraviolet or anything infrared is outside the range of our vision. So, we can't see that. We only see certain electromagnetic wavelengths, and we see them as colors, but they're not really colors. All right? There aren't any colors there. Furthermore, the world is not in 3 dimensions. According to a lot of physicists, including the inventor of superstring theory, for example, and according to Stephen Hawking, the world exists in 11 dimensions. And if you ask the question, well, why can't we see them then? The answer is they're rolled up very small. Right? So there you are. It's totally mind-bending. But it's what physics says. There are 11 dimensions. There's some dispute about how many dimensions there are. But there need to be 11 for mathematical purposes. That's what it comes down to. To make superstrings do what they have to do in 11 dimensions. Now, one way of coping with that is to say, this is just a mathematical construct. Right? It's not real. But most physicists don't like thinking they're just talking about mathematical constructs because they're just mental, constructs. They're not what's real. But that's what we have to say about observation as well, unfortunately. So mathematicians construct reality in one way, 11-dimensional wave functions, and they're not solid, of course. I mean, I've said you don't have colored clothing, but you're not solid. You're mostly empty space. I mean, James Jeans said that long ago. But in atoms, which we are made of atoms, there's mostly empty space. So that's what we are. So solidity is simply how we see a lot of empty space with little blobs of energy in it. And we see it as solid stuff. So what we see isn't what there is. Right? What you see is not what you get. Okay. So the world, we can show in physics, if you take physics seriously, we can show that the world is not the way it appears to us. And if you ask the question, well, what is it like? Let me just quote a very famous French Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Bernard d'Espagne, and he says, the reality with which physics now deals is a veiled reality. It's a reality with a veil drawn over it. We can't imagine it, we can't fully understand it, but our mathematical symbols, which contain some very strange imaginary numbers and various mathematical tricks that people play, they work. The mathematics works. Without that quantum mathematics, you would not have mobile phones. And you do have mobile phones, so it works. And there are lots of other ways it works as well. I have a friend who has, to my amazement, become a billionaire by inventing a quantum cryptography machine. Right now, quantum, you know what cryptography is? It's things which allow, on computers, you know, it stops you hacking into other people's stuff, and it is an ongoing thing. Well, the banks have bought that, which is how he bought what he invented, and that is a quantum cryptography machine. Now, what is that? The way he describes it is this. It operates in more than one reality at the same time. It operates in two universes at the same time, so it's very fast. Okay, so there you are. How does it operate in two universes? I haven't got the slightest idea, but the banks have bought it. You know, I'm going to try that on next week. So I've just invented a super quantum machine. Well, so we're talking about a strange world here. It's based on the principle of superposition. That is, that fundamental particles, so-called, we now know they're not particles really, fundamental particles exist in many places at the same time. So a quantum computer, for example, could use all these different bits of, all these different universes, you might call them, to do parallel computations. So these things work. Now, my point is this, right? You say, where am I going with all this? Well, it's to say matter isn't what it used to be. And it used to be pretty straightforward. You'd think it's lumps of stuff, and they've got mass, and they've got position, and they've got velocity, and that's what everything is made of. But that's all collapsed. Whatever there is out there does not, at the same time, have location and velocity. That's two of the things gone. Do they have mass? Well, no, it's the Higgs boson, as we now all know, which gives mass to particles. And the Higgs boson is an infinite field through which particles pass and gain mass on the way. Right. Now, I'm not making this up, I'm just quoting Stephen Hawking and anybody who's interested in quantum physics. So the philosophical point behind this is, if you ask what is real, it doesn't look as though materialism is a going concern, even though it's very fashionable in philosophy. And it looks as though mind is much more important to what we call reality than you might have thought. In fact, the reality that we see, that we think, here we are, people in a room, this reality would not exist at all without minds. So it's not the case that this reality would exist and then the mind is some sort of almost superficial extra item which is just produced by the brain. That's not the case. It's that this whole reality wouldn't exist as we experience it without mind. So what Stephen Hawking says at the end of all this, it's a very readable book, it's got nice pictures in, and what he says at the end of all this is, we think that we are products of history. There's been a long history of the universe, and we have come along at the end, or well, perhaps not the end, but a long time after the beginning anyway. But, he says, the truth is that our minds have constructed history. History hasn't constructed us, we have constructed history. And there are quantum physicists like John Wheeler, very famous quantum physicist, who says actually the Big Bang didn't exist until somebody thought of it. Now that is a rather extreme view, but an idealist would say that's just what I've been waiting for. Right? The Big Bang wouldn't exist unless somebody thought of it, and that somebody, guess what, was God. So without some mind, and it's not going to be my mind, you know, John Wheeler sounds fantastic because you think, how could some human mind bring the Big Bang into existence? Well, complicated ways of trying to explain that. But the fact is that it's much more straightforward if you say, no, it's true. the Big Bang as we think of it happening, we imagine it happening, so we, as it were, imagine we were there. We have computers to draw pictures which we can look at and say, well, it was a bit like this, perhaps. That's all a construct of our minds. Right? But there is a reality behind what our mind constructs, and that reality itself exists because it is observed by a cosmic mind. And there's the idealist view. There is one supreme mind without which material things could not exist. And what I've been saying is, look, nobody can deny that quantum physics works. It's the most beautiful, predictable, fantastically elegant theory that's ever been conceived by the human mind. But what it tells you, if you believe it, is the world is nothing like what we can imagine. It's really weird. So what is reality really? We don't know. Well, that's a bit of a disappointing conclusion, but the don't know entails also that it is mind-like, that we can't even think of reality, of matter, of the material universe, without thinking of a mind which conceives it. And that's idealism. Idealism is the view that matter depends upon mind for its existence. Let me try and state that rather carefully. Matter, the existence of solid particles having a location in space and appearing to us as colored, solid, etc., that those things would not exist without mind. And I think that is true. They would not. So if you say, what would exist without mind? We don't know, but it's something very weird. Perhaps it's beyond our imagination. Martin Rees, who is the astronomer royal, has said recently, we'll never understand it. Reality is such that the human mind just can't understand it. Well, if that's true, at least materialism can't be true, because materialists claim to understand reality and say, it's got to be like this. However, most philosophers, and I think of Immanuel Kant when I say most philosophers, right? Immanuel Kant, who's still a standard set text in all British universities, the world over probably, said, well, reality is mind-like. He called it noumenal. You remember he distinguished phenomenal reality, how things appear, from noumenal reality, from the Greek nous, which means mind. It's mind-like reality. And if you remember that, you see Kant was an idealist. He was somebody who thought, without mind, there can't be a material world. Now, we now know, I would submit, in our case, that there wouldn't be a world like the one we see without our minds. The idealist expands this and says, well, there wouldn't be a reality at all without mind. Now, I think that helps to explain how values can really exist. So let me devote just a few minutes to saying how it helps. In my last talk, I said, well, values are, in morality, you have a sense of obligation. Here's something which I feel I ought to do. It's objective. I don't make it up. It impresses itself upon me. And that's something that appears to be part of objective reality, but it's not physical. How could it exist at all? Laws of nature are the same, as I've said. How can they exist without a material universe at all? And similarly in art, experience of beauty, of what is communicated through art and through the beauties of nature, if that's objective, doesn't depend wholly upon me, how can beauty exist? Well, if you think, as an idealist, of a cosmic mind which makes reality real, because reality becomes a way of expressing the nature of mind. Mind needs to be expressed. You're not thinking of a mind which just exists on its own without being expressed. Just as our bodies express our characters, so the universe expresses the mind of God, this cosmic mentality. And if you think of it like that, then you can say, well, a value, let's start with the human case. Something you value, something you think is valuable, is your thought of a state which may or may not exist, but which would be good if it did exist. So a value is most easily conceived of as a thought of something that it would be good if it existed. That's a very mental property. It's not a physical property. Philosophers call it intentionality. Intentionality is the property of a thought, something that exists in a human mind, which is a thought of the future or of something which may or may not exist. That's the intention of the thought is about something. Intentionality is aboutness. Thoughts are about things. Berkeley again said this. I mean, he said thoughts are things that exist in human minds. They do exist, but they don't just exist as present realities, like a glass of water. I mean, so that's a glass of water. That exists. That's what it is. But it's not about anything. If you say, what's that glass of water about? It's not about anything. If it was a work of art, however, if this was a work of art, and it probably is somewhere, then you might say, what's it about? What's the meaning of it? What's the point of it? Why do that? I always feel that when well, no, I won't say that. My son is an artist, and he does things which mean something. And I'm sure they're wonderful. Yes, they are very wonderful. Sometimes you say, I can't see the meaning, what's it about? So art is about something. That sense of aboutness is a mental property. It's only minds which can be about anything, or they can make things which are about something, like thoughts. I'm just producing, electromagnetic vibrations, right? But actually they're about something. Well, I think they are anyway. So that's intentionality. So a value you can conceive intelligibly as the thought of a mind. And if there is a cosmic mind, the mind of God, then the thoughts in the mind of God can be those things which appear to us as values: beauty, truth, goodness. Yes, moral obligation. It is true, after all, that moral obligation is the voice of God. We may mistake that voice. We may think things are obligatory when they're really not. We're very familiar with that. But at least you can see how there could be real objective obligations if these were the demands or the ideals of a mind which had created the universe in order that somebody might help to realize those ideals. So again, this is not a very anthropomorphic view of God. You're not saying God is a person who has all sorts of weird ideas that he might or might not tell you about. You're thinking of a mind which conceives ideals which it becomes a human duty to help to realize: compassion and justice. And you're thinking of a mind which creates a universe in which it is a human obligation to strive for beauty and for the patterning of sensory experiences so that they create meaning in the minds of those who observe them. And that makes sense of art and morality. And not only that, it makes sense of laws of nature too. So what's a law of nature? Well, if you could think of a cosmic mind which formulated ideas of how the universe was going to go, then it's obvious that you could have laws before there is a universe. In fact, you'd have to. So that makes sense of that. Now, I have to admit that I say this quite often to conferences of scientists, quantum physicists in particular, and they don't get it. I must admit this, because it's not physics. You see, I've gone beyond physics, and conferences of physicists don't like people going beyond physics, really. They do like to think the physics can explain everything, really. So if it's not a physical explanation, they don't really think it's an explanation at all. So there's that question. If you say, well, the reason the universe is the way it is, and the reason that you have moral obligations and a sense of beauty, etc., the reason you have these senses that experience mediates some more profound reality beyond it, that's not a physical reason. It doesn't count as an explanation. So there's the big question for an idealist. Is idealism an explanation of anything? It doesn't tell you, like the law of gravity tells you, exactly how objects are going to behave. It doesn't enable you to predict anything. But I would make this distinction between two sorts of explanation. I think there are more than two, but I'll end by just distinguishing two: nomological explanation and axiological explanation. Now, nomological explanation is law-like explanation, and scientists usually use this. They say, I will explain why water boils at the temperature it does in terms of a law which tells you when liquids turn into gases and why they do so. So it's a law-like explanation. You're giving laws of how physical things behave. And that is a form of explanation, of course, very, very important. But there's also axiological explanation. Axia is the Greek for value. An axiological explanation is explanation in terms of value. You say, the reason this happens is because somebody valued it and wanted it to happen. And it's a perfectly good explanation. So if you say, this is an embarrassing question, but why did you come here today? Don't answer that. But part of the explanation, and it will be an explanation, is I wanted to hear something about idealism. You agree that would be an explanation. I wanted to know what idealism was. But you're not talking about laws there. There was no law that made you come here. You're just saying this was something I thought would be worthwhile, and I did it for that reason. So that explains why you're here. And most human affairs are explained in terms of value. To understand another person, you have to understand what they value, what they think is worthwhile, and what makes them think they can get it by doing what they're doing. Humans aren't very good at that, but it's still an axiological explanation. So, why can't you have an axiological explanation of the universe? It's not going to tell you anything about gravity. It's not going to help you to predict anything. It's not law-like, but it says the universe exists because some mind conceived good things that could only come about through the existence of this universe and created the universe for that reason. That's the value. Now, of course, to believe that, you have to believe it is a value. It might be a big leap for some people. But it makes sense as an explanation. It doesn't have to explain everything, but it adds to your understanding of the universe. The universe exists in order to produce moral values, values of beauty, and things that human beings can strive for. And I think that is a form of explanation. So I conclude this morning's lecture by saying idealism says that there is an ultimate axiological explanation of the universe that adds to our understanding. And whereas if you start as a materialist and you say somehow consciousness comes about accidentally from material particles getting together, but there's no reason for it, and we don't know how it comes about. Explanation seems to have failed at that point. Whereas if you look at an axiological explanation, you can say the whole development of the brain and the central nervous system and life on Earth, and perhaps in many other places too, came about in order to realize values of moral striving, creative understanding of beauty. Those are the sorts of things that are of ultimate value, and maybe the universe exists in order to realize those. Well, I think that would add a very important explanatory element, and that's what idealism is. Matter exists to realize the unfolding of the nature of mind. There is no hard problem of how mind comes out of matter. There are lots of problems about the brain, of course, but it's not a problem to say without a material world, minds could not communicate. They wouldn't be able to have friendship or any of the relations that people have. So there's my case for idealism with a little bit of physics thrown in, but it's really philosophy that I've been talking about. And in my next talk, I'm going to talk about a special sort of knowledge which adds to this set of experiences which mediate something beyond experience, and it's knowledge of persons, both in oneself and in others. And that's another dimension of experience which is transcendent, which goes beyond the sensory, but it has to come through the sensory. So there you are. I think we've got 10 minutes for questions or comments if you'd like to make them. Thank you.